We'll just give it a couple of minutes while other people join us, and then we'll get started.
Sure.
Okay, so shall we get underway, and welcome to you all, and thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon. I am really delighted to welcome Professor Alan Miller today as our speaker, and I shall introduce him properly in just one moment. Let me first say a quick word about this series of talks that we've set up. As you all know, the Centre for Sustainable Development, that is headed up by Dr. Tracy Morse, has a broad interest and concern for sustainable development. It embraces the global environmental and climate priorities that have been dominant in recent months, of course, but also the wider dimensions of sustainability, the global economic and social and cultural dimensions, and of course, our more immediate, our own campus operations. Equally, we are concerned not only for the higher income nations, but also for the middle and low income nations, and especially the impact of our actions today upon them. Our new International Development Series seeks to hear the voices of our partners throughout the world and those of leading global experts on the challenges and opportunities for meeting the SDGs through many different lenses. This is the second in the series. You may recall that the first was led by Lord Jack McConnell in recognition of the 15th anniversary of the Scotland-Malawi partnership. We hope to have several more talks throughout this year, and we will provide further details of these soon. Today, we are delighted to have Professor Alan Miller to speak to us. It's a great honor to have him here to tell us of his critical work with the UN in advancing the vision for global human rights. Alan is a professor of practice in human rights in the law school here at Strathclyde and a member of its Centre for the Study of Human Rights Law. He is a former special envoy with the UN, and he is now an independent expert in the UNDP Crisis Bureau. In Scotland, the First Minister appointed Alan in 2019 as the independent co-chair of the National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership to provide recommendations for a new human rights framework for Scotland to form the basis for the forthcoming Scottish Human Rights Bill. A report of this work was published in March last year, and the bill will incorporate 5 key human rights treaties, as well as include the right to a healthy environment. Alan has also had an outstanding international career. In this regard, and most relevant today, is Alan's work with the UN, leading a joint project headed by the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN Development Programme to capture emerging good practice and provide guidance to UN country teams on how to maximise the use of human rights to support governments in their efforts to achieve the SDGs. This is part of the response to the call by the UN Secretary General to provide practical guidance on the Universal Periodic Review of Global Human Rights. And I'm sure Alan will say more about that in a moment. And specifically today, Alan would like to review this recent work, which has come to fruition in the last few days with the publication of the UN report, UN Good Practices, How the Universal Periodic Review Process Supports Sustainable Development, and which perhaps fittingly, given the world at this hour today, he co-authored with his United Nations Ukrainian colleague, Irina Yakovleva. And the full report, I think we'll put it into the chat, is now available on the UNDP website. Alan will speak on 2 things today, both on his work in Scotland to introduce the new framework, and of course on his international work. And his title is How UN Country Teams Are Developing Good Practice in Maximising the Use of Human Rights to Support Government's Efforts to Achieve the SDGs, and outlining Scotland's contribution. And after he's spoken, we shall have time, of course, for questions. If you'd like to put these in the Q&A during the webinar, please. I'm sure Alan will see all this work as work in progress, with many nations having a long way to travel still on this journey. But the insights of the report are immensely valuable, and we are deeply grateful to Alan for coming here today. Thank you, Alan.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and thanks to Tracy and Fiona and everyone at the Centre for Sustainable Development. I'm very much pleased to be able to participate in this series, and I simply want to offer some reflections and to share this report with you, but then have discussion as much as is possible within the time we have. That was a very fulsome introduction. There's not very much left for me to add to it, but what I would like to do is share with you my reflections on the UN report, which was just published last Friday by the High Commissioner for Human Rights Office and the UN Development Programme. It presents examples of good practice taking place in many countries around the world in linking human rights with the SDGs. But more importantly, I think it attempts to offer insights into some of the challenges faced and recommendations for how to create greater momentum in linking human rights with the SDGs in every country. And as Andrew said, I was the lead author in this report, but my co-author was close Ukrainian UN colleague Irina, who thankfully is doing okay. But normally, I don't know if any of you out there actually know me or not, but normally I'm a pretty upbeat, positive speaker, but you'll forgive me if I'm a bit more sober-minded today, given the events unfolding in Ukraine. Let me begin by maybe just doing some scene setting and what is the context in which this report was decided to be needed and then published just last week. I think I'd like to make a couple of points in terms of the broader context of the report. The first is, as many of you may already, but to understand the UN system and the natural tension that exists within the UN system between state sovereignty and states very jealously protecting their sovereignty and that of accountability, a recognition of the need for all states to give up some of their state sovereignty for the greater good, for international rule of law. And it's a constant balancing or trade-off between those two since the very outset of the UN, and can be seen throughout the three pillars of the United Nations system, the three pillars being peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. And then secondly, the 2015 agreement of all member states for the Sustainable Development Goals really needs to be seen as being a high watermark of the UN system and a high watermark of finding a balance between state sovereignty on the one hand and states being keen to protect that and an acceptance of the greater good and of the need for global cooperation, in this case to achieve the global goals of the SDGs. So the 2015 agreement and the 2030 agenda that we're all familiar with, from that point of view, should be seen really as primarily a voluntary basis, respecting state sovereignty and being quite light, you could say, on accountability of states for the achievement of the SDGs. And since 2015, that really has been the growing realization and acceptance broadly, certainly within global civil society, but increasingly among governments too, that there is a need to introduce a greater degree of accountability on states and their efforts to achieve the 2030 agenda. And one of the ways in which this is being explored is in the form of holding states to account for their pre-existing obligations under the UN human rights treaties that they have ratified. And the relevance of these UN human rights treaties, these pre-existing obligations under international human rights law that these states have is in recognition that over 90% of the SDG goals and targets are clearly aligned with corresponding rights and duties to be found in these UN treaties. I won't go through them all, but the right to life, the right to health, the right to education, right to an adequate standard of living, right to equality, etc., etc. And the most effective way of leveraging these UN human rights treaty obligations to strengthen the efforts of governments to achieve the SDGs has been found to be in a relatively recent accountability process in the UN system. That is the Universal Periodic Review process introduced in 2006. And what that Universal Periodic Review, I'll refer to it as the UPR from now on, it itself is a balance struck between sovereignty and accountability. The way it works is that you start with the treaty obligations that all member states have ratified. There is then a periodic review, a cycle, so that every 4 to 5 years, every member state without exception is subject to a peer review by member states within the UN on its implementation of these obligations. And this review is informed by, first of all, the report from the state itself, its declaration as to how it's implementing its obligations on the ground, and then also reports from the UN system as to what it has learned from its monitoring of how the state has been implementing its obligations. And then, particularly importantly, from civil society organizations, particularly those within that member state working on the ground, who very often will provide a report that's called a shadow report or a parallel report or an alternative report to that of the state, essentially to keep the whole system honest and to make sure that there is as broad an understanding of the human rights situation within that country as is possible. So there is then a process of these other member states reviewing all of these reports and then making a series of recommendations to that member state who's under review as to what steps needed to be taken to further implement the obligations. This is a very important process because it's then a voluntary acceptance by those member states of the recommendations coming from its peers that then forms the basis for the implementation and acceptance of the need to implement these recommendations to improve the human rights performance by that member state concerned. And this is proven to be very helpful because the state in front of its peers has accepted these recommendations, committed to implement them, and that then is a sort of entry point for UN country teams in those member states, particularly on issues that otherwise would be very sensitive politically to advocate to these member states. It provides an entry point for them to say, well, look, you have accepted these recommendations, you've made these commitments, we will now work with you to enable you to implement them. And then it's a sort of cycle. The next time they're up, they will be reviewed for the extent to which they have implemented these recommendations. So it's within that context that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, within the last year or two, has really upped the game in terms of providing guidance and political advocacy that all member states should embrace this universal periodic review process, and that all UN country teams should make the maximum use of it in their advocacy for governments to step up their efforts to achieve the SDGs. And is proving successful. 100% of the member states are engaged in these cycles. So I think the headline that comes from the report might be seen to be that we looked at, over 60 countries in the 4 regions of the world. We put out a survey to all the UN country teams, a sort of questionnaire, and then we analyzed the results of the questionnaire in order to identify where there is emerging good practice, what are the challenges being faced across all the regions, and then what are the key recommendations, the key guidance that need to be given to UN country teams. And you have the report there, and I would encourage you to take some time, if you can, to look at it. There are 18 examples of emerging good practice in all regions of the world, and then we list the 5 key challenges, 5 key trends, and recommendations. My personal reflection, sort of taking a step back from it all, is that I think there is a key common thread that runs through the developing good practice, the challenges being found by the UN on the ground, and the recommendations that the report has made. And that key common thread is the need of public participation, enabling public participation from civil society organizations, from independent national human rights institutions, and from national parliaments. And at all stages of this process of being engaged in the report that goes from the member state to the UN system and the UPR process, being engaged in the implementation of the recommendations that come out of the peer review, and then being engaged in the monitoring of the implementation of these recommendations, and then the subsequent next cycle of reporting on what progress has or hasn't been made from that previous cycle's recommendations. So the need for public participation is overwhelming. It enables the voices of the most disempowered to be heard. And this is very much, as you know, a central theme of the SDGs of Leave No One Behind. It enables public ownership of human rights progress in their countries and of efforts to achieve the SDGs in their countries. And critically, it therefore enables the public to hold their governments to account for implementing both the commitments they made to the SDGs and the commitments they made to human rights under the Universal Periodic Review process, and linking of the two, that one reinforces the other very, very comprehensively. And I think this key common thread of public participation and accountability is more generally applicable throughout the whole UN system. And I've been involved with the UN for over 20 years in different parts of the world as a special envoy, and now with independent expert with its crisis bureau. The civil society is the lifeblood of the UN system. Ironically, the UN system is a state-centric, state-owned process, but the lifeblood comes from civil society. And any country that I'm asked to go to in mission to try and assess how further progress can be made in human rights and now increasingly SDGs, you look first of all to civil society. What space does it have in which it can work? What is its ability to hold governments to account? What is its awareness of the human rights and SDG commitments that its government has made? To what extent can it participate in the monitoring, the implementation, the reporting of the human rights and SDG commitments? And so when we have the high-level political forum, the voluntary reporting of nations to its SDG performance, I've also been involved in doing a survey of all of those countries, and maybe there'll be 20 or 30 a year will be presenting their voluntary reports to the the high-level political forum, which sort of monitors SDG progress. And you know, the reality is that in most of these countries that are presenting voluntary reports, there is shrinking democratic space. There is reduced public participation and reduced involvement of civil society organizations. What the report showed is that where you do have that democratic space, everything benefits from that, human rights, SDGs, but where you don't, it's the first early warning signs that things could go seriously wrong in this country, and a sort of preventative tool that is very, very important. So I would say that's certainly my takeaway from having authored the report, is the need for accountability and public participation. And of course, you know, this webinar taking place in Glasgow, University of Strathclyde, I think, excuse me, I think that was the overriding takeaway from COP26, the holding to account of governments and the commitments they made there in that context of the Paris Climate Agreement. So briefly, Scotland. What is Scotland's place in all of this? It's not a member state of the UN. It's a sub-state. It's a devolved authority, and yet punching above its weight, I would say. We have in Scotland, some of you may or may not have encountered this, a national performance framework, which basically has 11 outcomes of what kind of country we aspire to be. And the most, and it's refreshed every 4 or 5 years. And the most recent national performance framework that was agreed, and it's agreed by the Parliament, was explicitly aligned with the SDGs, and indeed specifically aligned with human rights, including as one of its 11 outcomes that we will respect, protect, and fulfill human rights and live free from discrimination. So in terms of aligning with the SDGs, it's right in the DNA of the National Performance Framework. And in terms of human rights, Andrew mentioned in the introduction, I've been leading a process which is going to result in the Human Rights Bill being introduced to the Parliament in the current session. It will be the biggest step ever taken on Scotland's human rights journey, and will bring into our law, policy and practice a whole range of UN human rights treaties, so that for the first time in a single place, the rights of everyone under international human rights law will be provided along with the right of equal enjoyment by all of these rights. So there will be the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, you know, the right to an adequate standard of living, health, education, social security, etc. The rights of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Covenant on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women and all forms of discrimination, racial discrimination. So the bringing into our law of these treaties will go a long way to ensuring that the national performance framework is achieved right across all of the outcomes contained within that, in a sort of mirror, a reflection of what's happening globally and the increasing efforts to try and by the UN to have countries link their human rights and SDG commitments in a unified way in order to increase the accountability of governments in their efforts to achieve sustainable development. So I think Scotland can rightly claim to be demonstrating leadership in both human rights and SDGs, and notwithstanding it's not a member state of the UN. And I think it can lay claim to this in 3 respects, very briefly. One, I think, as I've just said, the National Performance Framework and the new human rights framework that will be introduced by the bill, demonstrates explicitly the link being made by Scotland between human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals. Secondly, I think, and it's internationally recognized already as doing this, is it provides leadership in the UN call to all states to build back better from the pandemic. And the call from the UN is that building back better must have as its center economic, social, and environmental rights in order to address the structural inequalities that have been exposed by COVID and the response to COVID, and the underpinning climate crisis, which is ongoing. And so this new bill to be introduced in Scotland will include the right to a healthy environment, reflecting the underlying climate crisis. And then thirdly, I think the introduction of the bill and the SDGs being specifically aligned with the National Performance Framework does offer a reaffirmation of the international rules-based order, which, as we know, is under extreme pressure just now and in the last few years. So in conclusion, as I said at the outset, these are very, very challenging times that we're all living through, that the UN system has been subject to real pressure just now, and the international rules-based order is under threat. There are 3 UN pillars for the 21st century that were agreed at the beginning of the century by all UN member states: peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. And it's well understood within the UN system that you can't have sustainable development without peace and security. And you can't have peace and security without sustainable development. And you can't have either peace and security or sustainable development without human rights. And I think this report that we released last Friday does shine a light on how to make progress in linking human rights and SDGs, so 2 of the 3 pillars. But current events in Ukraine shine a light on the need and the continued need to make progress in achieving peace and security. And just to conclude, we had 2 days ago the announcement from the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court in The Hague that the court will be opening an investigation into the believed war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed in Ukraine. And that is all well and good. That there has to be accountability ultimately for war crimes and crimes against humanity. But in the here and now, of course, it's not enough. And I think the current events in Ukraine will and are shining a light on the veto power in the Security Council. And I've been working in and around the UN system for, as I say, over 20 years. My own view is that is always the elephant in the room. And the light needs to be shone on that ever brighter in the wake of the exercise by Russia of its veto in the Security Council last week. Other permanent 5 members of the Security Council have exercised their rights to veto in different contexts. And until that is effectively addressed, the UN system struggles and is vulnerable to the geopolitical challenges that on occasions can threaten to overwhelm, but have not yet overwhelmed, and I don't believe will overwhelm, but it is the elephant in the room. So, as I said at the outset, forgive me, I'm a little bit more sober-minded than I normally am, but these are tough times, and we can't shy away from that. But there you go. I'm very keen to engage now in discussion, do my best to answer any questions or listen to your points of view. And without any further ado, I'll pass back to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Alan. That's so interesting. Thank you for your your very thoughtful reflections. We've got some time for Q&A, and I've got some questions that have already come through, Alan, which perhaps I can pass through to you for your thoughts on. One question is, you have spoken about public participation and accountability. Could you share some specific examples of countries where you've seen this significantly improve or succeed? And what can we learn from that for Scotland and how we engage with these countries, particularly in terms of listening to the voices of the most marginalised and vulnerable? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think that the report, in terms of public participation, that I would encourage you to have a look at it. There are many countries where progress can be identified. Of course, no country has cracked it, has completed it, but Kenya, Malaysia, Serbia, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Samoa, Albania, Liberia, Vietnam, we all found that in the context of the SDGs, there was increased and increasing public participation, and particularly of civil society bodies, which was very encouraging. And ironically, in Ukraine, the 18th example that we include in the report, in the last few years, in the context of the and I've been there a couple of times with the UN in the last few years, and it's been a very tough environment because of the security concerns and therefore crackdowns on security by the Ukrainian government over a period of time since the partial annexation of part of its country by Russia. So it's been a very difficult environment, but real progress was being made in the last 3-4 years to open up civic democratic space. Civil society bodies were much more actively engaged in developing a human rights action plan for Ukraine, and the right to environment was becoming increasingly recognized and applied. So there are encouraging signs in many countries, but it has to be said that the trend is towards reduction of democratic space. It's shrinking in more countries than it's expanding, and in some countries very rapidly. We look, for example, within Russia today, and the restrictions on civil society, free press, are really a big part of the problem. Scotland, when I'm working abroad and you sort of look back at Scotland, we don't know how lucky we are in terms of the degree of public participation and the effectiveness of that on government policy practice and the shaping of legislation. In Scotland, it's been quite remarkable over the last decade how a human rights-based approach has entered the vocabulary. Everyone thinks they're doing it or wants to do it. Learning from those with lived experience has now become the sort of accepted way of how you make policy and improve practice and ensure laws are appropriate. So we have a big responsibility in Scotland, which I think we're taking up. The preparation of this human rights bill, as an example, was based to a large extent on public participation. And this year, there will be a much more extensive public participation as we get nearer the presentation of the bill and its drafting and introduction to the Parliament. So we have to maximise that in Scotland and demonstrate that this is the way in which lives can be improved. But globally, it's a real challenge, and it's becoming ever more so within the last few years.
Thank you, Alan. That's very helpful. I've got another question here, which is asking, and it's a very up-to-date question, obviously, in what way do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has affected progress towards the SDGs and the human rights issues, both in Scotland and globally?
Well, in Scotland, it's a bit easier to answer that. Globally, it's less easy. But in Scotland, my own involvement in this was the First Minister appointed me as the independent co-chair of this National Human Rights Task Force. to prepare recommendations for a human rights bill. And that was in October 2019. And I was co-chairing it with the cabinet secretary. And really my role, as I saw it myself as being the independent co-chair, was to sort of assess, well, what's the scale of ambition that the government has here? What's the ambition that I find among the public? And how can I try and sort of set the bar that it can be an achievable ambition? And I was, in my own mind thinking where that bar might be put. As COVID unfolded, it was remarkable how across all walks of life, all kinds of people in all parts of the country, that bar was raised, because people were increasingly coming to the view, maybe we should have known beforehand, but we didn't know how unequal our society was. Maybe we didn't know before, but we should have, how important environment and climate is to all of these pandemics that have happened and are going to continue to happen until we make peace with the environment. And therefore, we can't go back to where we were. We have to learn the lessons and build back better. And therefore the ambition was higher. And I therefore, along with others, sort of set the bar higher and to sort of test the government. Do you share this increased ambition? And it was a resounding yes. So where we ended up with the recommendations in March of last year was a much higher place than where it had looked like in October 2019, because of the lessons learned from COVID and the determination to do better. Globally, it's mixed. I mean, on the one hand, governments did respond in many, many countries to protect their people's lives and health, and mobilize all kinds of resources and built the capacity of scientific research in order to effectively tackle COVID. Many countries offered, social security and financial support to those most in need. But again, the elephant in the room is the vaccine nationalism, the inequity of the distribution of vaccines and the protection of intellectual property rights above the rights to health, the rights to life of those who are the most disempowered. And that, may not have come as a surprise to everyone, but I think it has also shocked people about the inequity and the inadequacy of the global cooperation in combating COVID. So a mixed picture, I would say, globally. In Scotland, it has been a catalyst for setting the bar high.
Thanks, Alan. Can I ask you a question that's related to that myself? Is that there's a lot of discussion about whether rights should be prioritized or not and how they might be prioritized. And some people, of course, argue that rights are sacred and that we shouldn't prioritize, we should be pursuing them all equally with equal determination. I suppose a couple of reflections really. Is it during the pandemic at various times you will know that in effect some rights were prioritized over others. The right to life, the right to health was in one sense prioritized over the right to free movement, and in some cases the right to education, we could say. And even pre-COVID and post-COVID, in every society there are scarce resources if we're in the real world, and there are necessarily political decisions are made about prioritization. Would you reflect a little bit on this whole question of the nature of prioritization with human rights, or whether that's a legitimate concept for you at all, and how in the real world you see it taken forward when you have these very, very real constraints on the decision-making of government?
Yeah, it's a great question, Andrew. And let me try and as briefly as possible give you my views. I think there is a range of internationally recognized human rights. Some are economic and social, health, education, standard of living. Some are seen as being civil and political. So freedom of movement, you mentioned, free speech, fair trial. The geopolitics in the world since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which had all of these rights together in 1948, the split, the Cold War and the post-Cold War, the West has prioritized individual civil political rights. Much of the rest of the world prioritized economic, social rights, sometimes at the cost of individual rights. What we've seen since the end of the Cold War has been a sort of reaffirmation that all these rights should have the same status and be treated equally if you're going to be able to achieve a life of human dignity. So big picture, all of these range of rights should be regarded in the same way with the same status. But then when you dig deeper, clearly in specific contexts, specific rights become more applicable than others. And the UN human rights system recognizes that and provides mechanisms and processes for how you reconcile what can be competing or might be perceived to be conflicting rights. You mentioned, right to health, right to life, and freedom of movement. And so there, if you take, the right to freedom of movement, that is a right that can be subject to proportionate restrictions if it serves a clearly defined public interest and the measures are no more than is necessary to achieve that public interest and for a temporary period of time. And so therefore, freedom of movement was curtailed for purposes of protecting right to life, and the state governments have a positive obligation to protect right to life. And as long as these measures are, as I say, serving a public good, they are brought in legally, not arbitrarily. They're subject to oversight of parliaments and accountability to the courts, and are enforced no longer than the period required. Then that is a balance that is struck between what might appear to be conflicting rights. Clearly, this is a bit of a debate, and you have, the anti-vaccine lobby. The sort of libertarian view is that you can't have that sort of more nuanced or sophisticated balancing of rights and the public interest being a very definite factor in achieving that balance. But the UN human rights system is, as I said at the outset, is based on striking these balances within an overall framework of requiring that all rights should be given equal status, but in particular context, that has to be adjusted, subject to certain safeguards.
Thanks, Alan. I've got a few more questions here. One specifically about Scotland. How will the proposed human rights bill fit with the proposed legislation on well-being and sustainable development? Do you see any role for the interministerial group on policy coherence for sustainable development to help bring these strands together, please?
Yeah, I mean, we're a small country, but sometimes we can complicate things an awful lot more than they need be, and have too many silos in our public policy making and law making. Although real steps are being made to make it much more coherent and integrated. And as I said, I think the National Performance Framework does bring together the SDGs and the human rights strands, but making sure that actually percolates down throughout and across all the portfolios in government is an ongoing challenge. I think the government is getting better. Does it still have a way to go? Absolutely. Does it recognize that? Yes, it does. So in terms of the specific question, there is a clear need for as close an alignment as possible of what working groups on ministerial groups on SDGs and on human rights. Even just, practically, Scotland has to make reports, through the UK to the high-level political forum on its SDG performance, and to the UN Human Rights Council and treaty body committees on its human rights performance. And because both of these mutually reinforce the other, then just from a government point of view, and I know this applies to many developing countries, to simplify the reporting and monitoring process, it makes so much more sense to have a coherent understanding of the interrelationship between these different strands of law, policy, and practice, and international commitment. So, long way around, yes, there should be ever closer integration between ministerial groups on SDGs and on human rights.
Good, thank you. There's another question here asking, there was concern when SDGs were originally agreed that they might undercut human rights obligations, but do you see examples where the SDGs have extended international human rights provisions?
Yes, I mean, there was that concern. I don't, and there still is, some people will still voice it. Personally, I haven't viewed it that way, and I don't view it that way. I think the two are mutually reinforcing. And what I found in my own experience going missions to countries where you would have real difficulty in raising sensitive human rights issues because of the, frankly, hostility of some governments towards human rights. I've been able to go to these countries and open up a space and a dialogue with governments through the entry point of the SDGs, saying, look, you have committed to the SDGs. Are you aware that over 90% of the SDGs are aligned with the UN human rights treaties, many of which you also have ratified? So they are mutually reinforcing. And can we therefore have a conversation about how you can progress both in terms of the commitments you've made to the SDGs, which, you know, can appear much more politically easy to do and to talk about and to report on, but it's opening the door to then having a discussion on the related and underlying human rights problems, which would prevent efforts to achieve the SDGs and therefore inhibit some of those countries from obtaining financial support from the international system to help them develop and their efforts to achieve the SDGs. So it's an entry point in countries where human rights otherwise you can't get on the table.
Thank you. Another question here, which is very much closer to home, is would you like to reflect on how can universities and academia specifically contribute to moving these issues forward in your judgment?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think hopefully this is a very, very modest contribution to Strathclyde and what it brings to the table. Clearly, the sort of weight of Strathclyde is, you know, in the technical engineering, scientific aspects of sustainable development. That's the sort of nature of the university. But I think also Strathclyde has its strengths. You know, there is a very good centre for environmental governance. We have the Human Rights Centre also in the law school. And I think playing to our strengths across the disciplines in Strathclyde can enable the university to make a very rounded contribution towards the efforts to achieve the SDGs. So that I think is one thing that needs done. And then I think more generally, universities have a role to play in having that sort of arm's length, detached, objective appraisal of the scale of challenges faced, the pros and cons of solutions to these problems, and ensuring that that weight of research and experience can be brought to in a very relevant way to the problems being faced by societies and by governments in particular. So having knowledge exchange and research with impact, I think universities are very well placed to do that. And certainly Strathclyde is doing that. And for example, in the work of the National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership, I was co-chairing that, but another member of the panel was Professor Lisa Margira, who's a global environmental professor in the law school. Dr. Elaine Webster was part of the academic advisory panel. So we were showing up, and these combined efforts, will be reflected in the bill when it's presented to Parliament.
Thank you very much indeed. Could I just ask you something about the empowerment of and participation of civil society? That you made a very important point in what you said, and you talked particularly about societies where there was reduced space for civil society. I would be interested to know what you thought we'd learned from the SDG process here, because you'll be aware that the voluntary national reviews have been a big plus, but they've also attracted a lot of criticism from some of the NGO communities who feel they're still too state dominated, or that the government has the final say what goes into a VNR. And there's been a call sometimes for having perhaps a parallel document from civil society that sits beside the government one, partly because government ones are always going to be a bit defensive about their own attitudes, and particularly at recent HLPFs, there's been a lot of criticism about governments failing to address the inequality dimensions within the SDGs and so on. Could you say a little bit about the mechanisms that you see by which civil society perhaps could gain a fairer voice, perhaps I might call it, in these sort of situations, and how that might be relevant to your human rights work?
Yeah, another great question, Andrew. I mean, I think just sort of unwinding a bit, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs in their formation were subject to a much greater degree of public participation than the Millennium Development Goals had been. And we saw the results of that. The SDGs are a much, much improved set of goals than the MDGs had been. And what came through very significantly in all of that prior public consultation was the importance that human rights be on the table and part of the SDG process. And so, the SDGs then were explicitly then grounded in the international human rights system. However, then the process of implementation and of accountability has been weaker than civil society bodies had wanted. And there is a sort of, wall between Geneva and New York within the UN system, where, so putting it bluntly, Geneva and the Human Rights Council does the human rights stuff. New York high-level political forum does the SDGs and the peace and security stuff. And so civil society bodies and national human rights institutions have been increasingly advocating that those two have to be integrated, and that the high-level political forum, for example, when they have these voluntary national reviews, there should be at least some UN report from Geneva on those governments' integration or not of their human rights commitments and the SDGs as part of the voluntary national review process. Some countries are opening up space for civil society and national human rights institutions to be part of the voluntary national review preparation and actual presentation. But it's also leveraging the whole UN system itself, that across these three pillars of development, security, and human rights, that they are much more integrated and speak to one another, including within the high-level political forum. Having said that, I think the real accountability for government's efforts to achieve the SDGs actually comes at the national level. I think really no matter what you do at the international level and how much improvement we engineer, it's at the national level. And that's why I was emphasizing that It's the on-the-ground ability of civil society organizations to empower people to hold governments to account for the achievement of the SDGs and implementation of the human rights obligation. That's where the rubber hits the road very much.
That's great, Alan. We need to draw this to a close, but before we did, I wondered whether there was any sort of final thoughts or that you might like to offer us, because you've left us with a huge amount to think about. Are there any other thoughts that you wanted to leave with us before we close down?
No, I don't think so, Andrew. I'll stand between everyone and going off for some lunch. I think a good hearing. I hope it stimulates some thinking and some more discussion and as I say, more collaboration across the university, and that it helps the Centre for Sustainable Development take forward its programme of work across the disciplines. So hope to have helped that and happy to continue to contribute in time to come.
Well, may I express our great appreciation to you for your talk today and for your response to our questions. I think your insights and your first-hand experience of the implementation challenges here has been very helpful indeed, and as I say, left us a lot to think about. So thank you to all who have attended today and for your questions. And most of all, of course, a huge thanks to you, Alan. That was really, really good. So thank you all, and goodbye to you. Thank you.
Goodbye.